Welcome everyone to our July 2026 Desh-Videsh discussion. The Desh-Videsh series by Hindus for Human Rights is a transnational discussion platform that brings together voices from India and the diaspora to critically engage contemporary political, social, and cultural issues. And we all know there are plenty of things there to talk about. Framed around the relationship between home, which is Desh, and abroad, Videsh, the series creates space for nuanced, often difficult conversations on topics such as nationalism, caste, minority rights, and the global circulation of ideologies such as Hindutva. Rather than simply informing, it aims to foster dialogue across contexts and perspectives, foregrounding human rights, pluralism, and critical reflection within and beyond Hindu communities. At its core, today's discussion addresses a fundamental question. How does rewriting India's history serve as a tool to engineer its future? And how does that project cross international borders? We'll be looking at how historical revisionism in India and diaspora mobilization in the West form a single synchronized pipeline. Joining us to break all of this down is Dr. Ruchika Sharma, historian and creator of Eyeshadows and Itihas, who uses digital storytelling and myth busting to counter historical revisionism and medieval myths in India. Welcome. We also have Dr. Dheepa Sundaram, associate professor at the University of Denver, whose research focuses on online Hindu nationalism, algorithmic propaganda, and how US-based groups sanitize right-wing narratives for global audiences. As always, the speakers' views are their own and do not reflect the official position of Hindus for Human Rights. Welcome to both of you and welcome to everyone who's joined us. Let's get right into it. Ruchika, your work directly confronts revisionist myths in India. How are historical narratives about medieval India, temple destructions, and royal patronage being systemically rewritten, both institutionally through textbook cuts, like the NCERT, and informally through our famous WhatsApp University? How and why is historical revisionism like this central to the Hindutva project?
Thank you so much, Nandini, and I'm glad to be a part of this. What seems like a very enriching discussion. I'm sure I'll learn so much more. To answer your question, I'll come to the second one first. How historical revisionism is actually very central to the idea of Hindutva. That is because when Hindutva was being formulated, especially by people like V.D. Savarkar and Golwalkar, history was a very important part of it. So, for example, one of the things that Savarkar talks about in his writings is as to how the age of the Muslims that he thinks to be, which is basically the medieval period, he considers them to be dark ages. And it's a fascinating thing that he thinks of that particular time period to be something which, where there was no development, where there was only a lot of violence, a lot of brutality. And fascinatingly, something like this term finds itself in the NCERT books today. The latest version of the NCERT Class 8 textbook has a preface to the chapter which talks about the Delhi Sultanates and the Mughals. And fascinatingly, that preface talks about how there are some dark periods in history and compares them to Nazi Germany, which I think is not just exaggerated, but also ahistorical, because the fact that you could compare a pre-modern state with a modern one is just a complete no-no in history, because a pre-modern state is not capable of destroying cities at one go. which I think the modern state was, for example, Nazi Germany did with air bombing, etc. Or for that matter, London did on Germany, like the bombing of Dresden, etc. That was just unthinkable of in the pre-modern times. So apart from the fact that this is a grossly ahistorical comparison, it's fascinating as to how there is a direct link between what Savarkar wrote and what is being used in the NCERT textbooks today. To come to your first question, as to how, this is sort of circulating in the NCERT textbooks as well as the WhatsApp forwards. I think the WhatsApp forwards came first. And as long as it was only confined to the WhatsApp forwards, it was a problem, but it was a lesser problem. The reason being that a lot of these WhatsApp forwards were circulated by people who were either in their 50s, 60s, or their 40s. This would go on about this whole idea of course, a lot of communalization of Indian history, the fact that Hindus and Muslims have always existed the way they exist today, which again is a very ahistorical idea. The idea of religion, the way we view religion today was not how we used to view it at that point of time. For example, the idea of Hinduism itself is a 20th century construct. Before that, history is full of examples of Shaivism versus Vaishnavism versus Buddhism versus Jainism. There are scores upon scores of historians who've written about how Jainism and Buddhism took a huge blow with the coming of Bhakti movement down south. So all of that sort of gets washed away in this idea of, looking at Hindu and Muslim as this two silo, watertight sort of religions. What's fascinating is that then it sort of poured over into NCERT textbook. And I think that is far more dangerous simply because of the fact that these are 13-year-old, 12-year-olds who are being taught, for example, the words that are used for the description of the Mughal rulers and the Delhi Sultanate rulers are not used to describe, for example, the Cholas. So when, say, Akbar has a siege of Chittor, he's described as a brutal ruler, right? But when the Chola kingdom take their navy to the kingdom of Srivijaya, there is no idea of brutality over there. So it's fascinating as to how a Mughal ruler is brutal for doing probably the same amount of violence that the Chola army must have done in Srivijaya, or maybe the Chola army did even more, considering they did a total of 13 raids on Srivijaya. So, but the idea, therefore, is the child walks away thinking that it was only the Mughal rulers who were extremely brutal, who were extremely cruel. They are the only ones who've done temple destruction, something that I've been bringing up in a lot of my videos and forthcoming writings, is the fact that there is a whole history of temple destruction where rulers were non-Muslims, today called as Hindus, were the ones who had destroyed temples, and for myriad reasons, so financial reasons, they just wanted to loot temple and destroy it. For political reasons, this was a ruler that was no longer ruling, or they capture an enemy territory, so they destroy the temple which is associated with the ruler as an attack on the ruler's legacy. And purely religious reasons as well. So, for example, a lot of the Buddhist stupas have been broken down for repurposing in Shaivite shrines, etc. So there have been examples upon examples of, before the Muslims come in, before the Mughals or the Delhi Sultans come in, before the Turks come in, where there is a lot of temple destruction that is already happening, but NCERT completely wipes that away. So I think that's a lot more poisonous, because these are very young, impressionable minds. And when they go away thinking that, well, Muslims have caused us a lot of trouble, and, this idea that their leaders today say in their political rallies as well, of 1,000 years of slavery, I think it's sadly found itself into the NCERT textbooks, and I think that's very dangerous.
Very interesting, and thank you for that. There's so much of this messaging that is distilled into such facile binaries, and that makes its way into social media. Deepa, building on that, from a media and digital perspective, how do these domestic Indian narratives get packaged for digital transmission? And what makes a complex, and we just saw the complexity right there, what makes a complex historical lie so easily downloadable, shareable, and digestible across digital networks? How are they weaponized? Little history bites, which are specifically tailored to travel across borders and reshape how the diaspora understands its own identity and politics. There's sort of interlinked questions. So take it from wherever you'd like.
Thank you, Nandini. I think it's a really good question. But before I begin, I just want to thank Hindus for Human Rights for having such a conversation. I think it's really important to think about history as in the present. It's rare. And as I was saying before we began, a couple of things about me. First, I'm not a historian. I am a semiotician, so I look at meaning making. That's my interest in meaning making mechanisms. And it's also important for me to sort of say one word about my own positionality. In addition to being a tenured professor at a Research One institution, my family comes from South Indian Brahmins. They were privileged to be able to come to the United States. I was born there. And that privilege is something we often, efface as Western academics. And so I think it's really important to note that caste privilege as well as class privilege. As we know, most immigrants are wealthier than we give them credit for, even though the news doesn't like to paint that. So if you'll forgive that indulgence before I begin. The other thing I wanted to sort of say before we sort of jump into the specifics is, one thing that Dr. Sharma had sort of pointed to, I think spoke really well about, I have to say, I really appreciate the way you gave specifics in the insert and compared that to the dialogue, because that is the big problem, is that I think people often miss the amorphous sort of network of issues that then get distilled into these very specific problematic questions into the insert, which I do follow, but I'm not obviously in India. But we have that here. So I think that one of the things that I want to speak to is the broader issue, three issues that come out of what Dr. Sharma have talked about that get distilled into transnational media networks, both print and digital, which are issues around the term decoloniality in all its versions, indigeneity, which is a really easily manipulated term in a global context, particularly as is decoloniality, as Walter Magdolo unfortunately found out. And those two in particular, but then the other one is this idea of authentic and authenticity. And that one's a harder one because it also gets conflated with authority. Who's got the authority to speak and what is the real true, right? Whatever that looks like. So those three sort of, if we want to think of them as ideological pillars that sort of guide what I see online, that's where, Nandini, to get to your question of how do we get soundbiteable histories, I wouldn't think of it as anyone looking at a specific historical document or anything like that, right? They are actually looking at WhatsApp forwards. And I loved that Dr. Sharma started with WhatsApp, because it did, right? You have people who are looking at something. I'll tell you how, and I'll give you one story, and then I'll give you one example from my own research, right? So this is a story from my research as well. I'll leave the names out just so that I'm still allowed back in the country. But I had started interviewing priests, and not just any Hindu priests, but Dikshitars, so people who are training other priests. You can think of them like bishops in the Catholic Church, right? And I was interviewing them to find out what they knew about online rituals, which is what my research looked at when I first started looking at it. Now I look at hate. It's less glamorous, let me tell you. But so I was looking at this, and I talked to many priests across South India, and I spoke to a particular priest, a very high up priest. This person was politically connected as well as also being a very prominent trainer of priests. And so I'm speaking to him and I'm trying to explain, I'm looking at WhatsApp groups and what's being shared there. And WhatsApp was where we were able to sort of connect. It wasn't a language barrier. It was literally a technology barrier. It was very difficult for me to explain. I'm like, no, like you look on your phone, right? So these priests do not go on the internet. They are not on websites. They are not talking to people who are creating websites. Their temple might have a website. Their mutt might have a website, right? But they are not involved in that. What they do have are mobile phones, and they are often texting and WhatsApping everyone, right? So after this interview concluded, I learned a lot of valuable information. I came home and I had a WhatsApp forward because he shared his WhatsApp number and put me into his group, which I thought was really kind. So I thought I would be able to see what else he's sharing. He's like, you can see what I share with my, my flock, I guess. Anyway, so this guy sends me a WhatsApp of this. Did you see this beautiful temple for Durga destroyed? And they uncovered it. It was covered up by a mosque. And look, they found it. And I was looking at this and I'm like, this was okay. I just want to be clear. This was in 2019 or no, 2018 or 2019. So AI wasn't as big of a thing, but this was clearly an AI generated image, which it took me and my spouse about, I don't know, an hour to figure out that it was actually done by this artist, right? But he hadn't created this. I'm not putting this priest on the spot, okay? He hadn't created this. Somebody sent this to him. But remember, he's a person who does not go on the internet, right? He thought of it as something that confirmed a narrative that he believed to be true. He then shared it as a symbol of authority because he's a priest. You have any idea how many people out there will take for gospel whatever somebody sends them that's a priest? Why would he send me something that's wrong? This is a literal statement from an uncle of mine. He's a priest. He's supposed to do that, right? So I share this, and then I'll give you one example from my own work of how this gets distilled into these spaces, right? By the way, that particular image shows up in a number of the Facebook Hindu temple groups and things like that. I've seen it several times since then, right? But an example from my own work is that historical narratives get soundbited from these WhatsApp forwards, or what they do is they don't even go to books. They go to blogs. So there are two blogs in particular that show up a lot in the WhatsApp groups I study, or sorry, excuse me, Facebook groups I study. And I don't think I gave that preamble, but essentially I spend most of my time in about 50 or 60 Facebook purportedly, and I'll put them in scare quotes, Hindu groups, but they're mostly Hindutva groups. They're named anywhere from like historic temples, India forever, Vedic knowledge, you name it, right? A lot of signifiers of authenticity and authority, right? But what you often find in there is propaganda. A lot of it is Islamophobic propaganda. A lot of it's misogynistic. A lot of it is anti-caste, anti-Dalit. It is caste terror in language, basically. Just horrifying, a lot of overlap there. I've written about that. So if you look up my work, you can see that. And a lot of it is exactly what Dr. Sharma mentioned, right? These narratives that are completely false, but also, and as you beautifully said, inflammatory. They are intended not just to be false, because they'll have a kernel of truth, right? Like you can have a nuanced conversation about various kinds of warfare over time, right? But that wasn't the point, right? So you'll see the same thing. And the one example I'll give you is that we see people who take things like a law that's up for debate. Let's take something like the UGC or something like the caste census, right? Whether or not we should have this and whether or not we should have a uniform code, right? The UCC code, that is something that, and the UGC stuff also came into these debates, right? But what you'll see is people making so-called informed debates using history that are really about promoting this particular point of view. So they'll selectively choose things that are non-contextually factually true, right? Like there are people who abuse reservation systems, something like that, right? And then they'll take that and say, so this is why. And then they'll give like one example, again, anecdotal, of like somebody who's done really well for themselves that has a caste oppression background. And then they'll use that as an argument and people will see that. So that's how it gets soundbited. It's a little bit different. And then the one other piece of this, and I won't go into it, we can talk about it later, is that you'll also see, for example, little bits that come not from history books, but from blogs. And as I was starting to say, true Indology is one. And then India, I'm sorry, I want to make sure I'm correct on this. There's an Indian history group that posts a bunch of these on the Facebook pages that I look at, and they take it from something called My India, My Glory. And this is really commonly seen. So I'll stop there, but I'm happy to say more. But it's really what Dr. Sharma is talking about gets distilled into another system called these blogs, then that gets tweeted or somehow refracted into various other social media spaces, maybe a TikTok video, maybe an Instagram reel. And then you see that filter in and being connected to specific debates around law or education. And those aren't always just in India, but sometimes you see them, for example, around the anti-caste discrimination bills in California.
How interesting. I mean, I think we've got a lot to talk about, that, but there's so much just in there. There's misinformation, disinformation, and then there's malinformation, where, there's a particular reason and there's an agenda on why and how particular things are being shared. But one of the things we're seeing, and this is to both of you, and you can take it, if you want to respond to that, we're seeing historians in India, of course, facing this textbook erasures, institutional censorship, while diaspora academics and public educators, they face the coordinated online harassment and bad faith anti-Hindu smears, because the moment you speak like this, that's the natural sort of space they go into, you're anti-Hindu. How are these pressures then threatening the future of how South Asian history can even be taught or researched globally? And what has your experience been as academics in this field?
Should I go ahead, Deepa? Is
Please.
that? I just want to respond to the fact that I think the online harassment is something that a lot of young public speaking historians also face in India. So I am, of course, one. With me, of course, is also the fact that I'm a woman. So there's a lot of misogyny also sort of piled in. But I think what's even more important is the fact that this is not just random harassment. There is always random harassment when it comes to the internet, just by the fact that I'm a woman, I'll be harassed anyway. But this is also, I think, very carefully crafted harassment, which is intended to ensure that if you harass, somebody enough, they'd probably keep quiet. So there is a lot of money being poured into it. This is not just an organic thing. This is something that has been built, an institution that has been created, the IT cell, so that, which is of course one to propagate a lot of disinformation. So I think people like True Indology, etc., have been roped into it, although I think True Indology existed even before all of this. So there is a top-down approach, and then there is a bottom-up approach, and I think True Indology was from here. Clearly, Hindutva is something that is not just something that this government has sort of brought in from 2014 onwards. It's existed before that, and I think True Indology is one of those. But through that, because of the top down, there have been even more. So something that I see happen in real time, every time I put out a video or something, within seconds, there'll be people, who'd come to harass me, talk about, what I'm wearing, what I'm saying, that I'm outrightly lying. Or they'll have because now AI is so accessible, they'll have these pointers, which apparently debunk what I'm saying. So it's fascinating to sort of see that in real time. But while this is a huge challenge, I think a bigger challenge for academics in India is there aren't a lot of public, historians who are sort of willing to take this up. Sure, there is a lot of writing for the public, but I think a lot of that is in English. And the disinformation crowd is largely a Hindi belt crowd. That is where most of the disinformation, something that I saw with my channel, I started in English because this is the language that I've done all my education in. So, it's something that comes very easily to me when I'm talking about history. For the first 6 or 7 months, it was in English, so its reach was obviously limited. And the response was generally very good. But the moment I switched on to Hindi, it almost opened a Pandora's box, and which also made me sort of happy because I think it sort of made me realize that it's now reaching to the people who really need this information, right? So I think that is where there is a problem, with public historians in India as well, is the fact that there is, firstly, of course, because of a lot of these pressures that you're talking about, there is, of course, a hesitancy to come forward. But also, I think this idea that, this needs to sort of circulate in different languages, and not just in books, because this is not a crowd that reads books, sadly. And this is a crowd that does actually, find bite-sized history very accessible. So either, so it's like an either-or situation. Either we work from the ground up and, create a reading culture in India where everybody is reading books, especially non-fiction, for fun. Or we sort of take to this which is just flooded with disinformation, and we sort of combat it digitally. So I think that is one of the quandary that public historians face. But also, I think, because you spoke about research, I think historical research in India faces an even bigger issue, and that is of funding. There is not a lot of funds that are allocated to the humanities. This is another reason why, and I think it's fascinating, a lot of the so-called right-wing narratives, which are flooded with this misinformation and deliberate disinformation, come from largely the engineering crowd, because there is this idea that doing history requires no methodological experience, no methodological knowledge. Anybody can do that. And I think that's sort of instilled in the Indian education system, because when you're supposed to, after you clear your class 10th, when you take your exams for class 11th and 12th, before that, your class 10th marks will decide whether you get science, whether you get commerce, whether you get humanities, which I think is ridiculous in this day and age, because it should be your aptitude which should decide. There should be a baseline that, okay, you've cleared class 10th, and now you could, give an aptitude test and figure out. But that is not the case. So the creme de la creme, apparently the people who score 90% and above will get science, and then 70 to 90 commerce, and then everybody that gets less than 70 or less than 65% get humanities. Something that I faced, because I got 94% in 10th. So there was a lot of, issue at home that, why didn't you take science, etc. But anyway, I always wanted to study history. So something that I ended up studying history only. So I think that is where this idea comes from, which is why the government accordingly allocates the least amount of funds when it comes to humanities, and now even further. So already there was a lot of funding which was being directed towards engineering, etc. But now the push is towards the kind of history that they want to talk about. So, for example, this idea of opening, the Center for Brahmanical Studies at JNU, or the Center for Vedic Studies, or the Center for Sanskrit Studies. These are all fascinating names. It's not like when we had the Center for Historical Studies, where I've done all my education from when it comes to history in JNU. It's not like they don't have an ancient department where Vedas and Sanskrit is not taught. Of course it is. But there is this idea that is the history that we're sort of combating, and that is the so-called left-leaning history, and we don't want that. So we're going to open a different center. So any sort of research which is now happening on medieval India either has to be in basically showing how medieval India was a terrible place, right, and brutal. That sort of a research will get funding. Or research which says that ancient India was a glorious place will get funding. And it's kind of sad because, this just sort of, firstly, erases all complexities of Indian history. And secondly, you don't do research like that. You're no longer giving a research grant. You're basically giving an ideological propaganda grant. So I think there is that layer as well, where a lot of well-meaning historians who do want to pursue research, it's very difficult for them, even more so now, especially on medieval India, because that has got almost zero funding.
So interesting to get that insight. Thank you very much. But we do have a lot to cover. So, Deepa, did you want to quickly maybe talk about that, or shall we?
No, I'll
move?
just say quickly that the online harassment piece of this is something that's really global and it's really scary. And I think a lot of people don't realize that people can harm you from other places. And so I'll just quickly say that I had a colleague who studies, he's a historian, but he lives in the US, but his parents were actually swatted by Hindutva activists or terrorists online, right? And so I think, it's really important to underscore one thing, everything that Dr. Sharma said, but in particular that you're not getting a lot of people who want to get involved in this because in India, it's even scarier. As a woman, it's even scarier, partly because it's like the system is against you, like she very eloquently pointed out, and it's terrifying if you're going to strike out on your own. Like things could happen not just to you, but what if you want to protect your family? I'm thinking also of Meena Kandasamy. Like she's another person that she faced threats to her 4-year-old daughter for speaking about this in a conference that I was in, right, on dismantling global Hindutva. So I just want to point out that it's really like we often think about privilege as just class and caste and sort of where you're located, but the ways in which online terrorism works is in part to really make you feel like you're alone and that you can be gotten to anywhere. And I think I often tell my friends white supremacy has nothing on what Hindutva can do because these people, and a lot of my friends who have interacted with them are like, you are correct. But I just want to be clear that the reach of this is global. And then I'll end with this. Some of you might know that the Indian government may or may not have been involved in the murder of activists in Canada and an attempted murder in the United States. So this is not something that's just like in the realm of we don't like these thoughts. We are now seeing coordinated efforts with the government using some of this anger to sort of like take out ideological enemies around the world potentially. And that to me is very scary because that's weaponizing hate in a very specific governmental way that I think that, so we shouldn't just ignore this for the threat, but we should also be thinking about the ways in which this is helping, what I would call an authoritarian government engage in more repression as we're even seeing right now in India.
That is actually terrifying. Um, I'll move on to the next part, which is about the algorithmic nationalism, how fake history travels and binds the diaspora. So, Deepa, again, your research examines how platform recommendations models reinforce casteism and Hindu nationalism. How does raw anti-minority disinformation from India get laundered abroad into this respectable middle-class diaspora identity or heritage preservation campaigns? And what are the roots of this? And what are the implications, of course, for diaspora identity and politics in this moment? And we know this is a very interesting moment. How do you see this all playing out?
Well, I mean, let me first say, and I'm sure Dr. Sharma will have much more relevant information being in Delhi, but as I said to you before Dr. Sharma joined, we're witnessing our first middle class Hindu protest, I think, in India in a lot of ways, and we're watching a bunch of people that have like not grown up with like a Congress party to blame to say, I'm sorry, but that doesn't land. You're calling me a Pakistani. What are you talking about, right? Like those arguments aren't landing. So it's not that they're not Islamophobic. Let me be really clear. These are still probably kids that hold Islamophobic views. They're probably holding casteist views. They're probably holding a bunch of other really you know, really like concerning views, but they're engaging in this in part because they're watching a government that they wanted to see hold accountable, that has talked about accountability the entire time, and then is just like really screwing them over, right? And they don't like that. And that's something that we're watching happen. I think that if we want to think about why this is the thing, is really getting to what you asked in terms of this question, right? Like algorithmic misinformation has made it really easy for divisive issues to take precedence over real issues, right? So like when we saw CAA, NRC protests in India and the way that information came to NRIs, right, the non-resident Indians, was that, oh, it's just another Bandh in India. Like, India protests all the time. And this is like literally what everyone told me. They're like, oh, it's just another thing. But then, you know what, Rihanna takes it up, right? Maya Harris takes it up. And then you see people being like, oh, these kids, you know, we have to support them. And look, they're Islamophobic. So you see a bunch of leftist Indians and progressive Indians, which are most Indians, say how much they're really sad about this, right? Then you see the people that are like more right wing, you know, saying like, oh, you don't understand India. The Muslims are different there. This is like literally a statement you hear, which is shocking to say out loud as a, right? And then you get to the point of where you get the coalescence, in my view, between these groups, because there is no laundering per se, Nandini. What I would argue is that these people held these views, they kept them there, and then they found a different way to like express them. That's why anti-blackness and anti-Muslim sentiment is still a huge problem, right, in diaspora communities. But when you ask them, push comes to shove, like where they come together, they'll be like, India is a different country. You do not understand what they need to do there. That is not what we can do in the United States, right? So their liberalism is literally in a bubble called I am in the US or I am in Canada, and therefore I get to hold a different set of views. And I do think that's really important. I've actually, my new research is looking at this as immigrant exceptionalism, and looking at South Asian immigrant communities and sort of how they've adopted American exceptionalist ideas and really just used it to weaponize their worst biases and hatreds as a community. And a lot of the anti-immigrant sentiment, I think, has made them feel fearful because they've always been the model minority. And so instead of sort of finding a way to find cross minority solidarity, right, and intersectional solidarity, they're doubling down and entrenching themselves on the one, like, in my view, some of the aspects of whiteness that they have always helped, right, like held, which are, you know, this idea that they have merit-based meritocracy, right? Like that they're going to get up, and Ajanta Subramanian's work on caste of merit really brings this out if folks want to read about it, on how caste plays into that, right? They also always believe that they would do well enough, right? Like Indian minority is doing well. So when you think about all of that, right? So what happens is it's not misinformation. What you'll see is somebody taking a statement and then refracting it through that lens. So you'll see something like, look at these kids protesting. That's a statement that's fairly true, right? But then they'll go on to say, you know, it's really amazing to me that these kids in India have become so privileged that they have the time to sit around protesting, right? That'll be a comment. So it's like,
Yeah.
what I'm saying is it's about their, and so you've seen a lot of videos, if you go on Instagram, I'll end with this, of people saying, like kids in India saying to their own NRA family, stay the hell out of it. Like, I
Yeah.
need you not to be involved if you are not here, right? And mainly because, not because they want to alienate them, but they're like, you don't understand what I'm dealing with. And so I think that there is like, this isn't really going to like disrupt anything grand, but I do think this kind of disconnect is really interesting to me politically, because part of the reason that the Modi government has looked like a floundering fish in dealing with this particular issue and their repression isn't working is that there's no target for them. I mean, just Dipke is not a target. Like, he's just a guy. He's literally just like the cockroach leader, right? So he doesn't make sense. Now he has typhoid. Like, you just look like a jerk. Like, you know what I mean? There's no person for them to target. And then in the NRIs, all they can say is kids these days, right? So you're going to end up having these nuanced conversations that are coming out of this movement that I think are going to change some things. But I really want to emphasize that it's not so much misinformation, but it's long, deeply held biases that are very easily weaponized in this climate around the world of populist, anti-immigrant sentiment, misogyny, right, and Islamophobia. We have global hatreds and we all hate them together. We don't have to eat together, but we love to hate together. We hate people that are Muslim. We hate people that are Black. We hate people that are queer for some reason. When I say we, I'm talking about these groups, right? So it's not a question of having to worry about that. All you have to do is say the right dog whistle and you'll bring groups together. They're not hanging out, but they're absolutely putting out the same hate propaganda.
Thank you for that. So much truth there. I want to go now to the cost of this disinformation and just go a little bit deeper into that. Ruchika, common defense is that historical debate is just academic arguments, disagreements, or just, harmless memes. And we've talked a little bit about that, cause. But how does this fake historical narrative directly fuel the real world mob violence, the site reclamations, that's now a big thing, legal persecutions against minorities in India today?
Yeah, I think that's a pertinent question. The reason why, and at the outset, you would think that there would always be a difference between something which is academic and its popular version, right? And that is fine. So there is always a difference between popular history and academic history, and I think that gap will always stay for practical reasons. The problem now is that, firstly, of course, the gap is huge. But also the fact that this is having massive real world consequences. So the closest that comes to memory is this release of this movie called Chhawa, and how it was actually shown to students who were studying in class 9th, class 10th. It was considered to be educational. The Maharashtra CM went, in his parliament, and he said in the Lok Sabha, in the Maharashtra Lok Sabha, the Legislative Assembly, he said that this is something which is very educative and everybody should see it. You should take your kids to see, this is very good history. And what it actually does is, of course, the fact that it's very ahistorical, but the ridiculousness of saying that you should learn actual history from a Bollywood movie, was just something that was so striking, right? And it had real world consequences. It led to riots in Nagpur. People actually felt that whatever was shown in the movie was something that had happened to Sambhaji, and that there was something very exceptional in history and must have happened because, this is how Muslims are, and this is how Muslims have always been. And therefore, we are now going to avenge what happened, 300 years ago or 400 years ago. I think that is where the real world consequence of this disinformation is. The narrative which says that, we have been wronged for the past 1,000 years. So much has been taken away from us. Our women were raped, our temples were blown apart. And therefore, what it does is it creates this idea that now what can I do, as a person who's listening to all of this and is completely, seeped in this narrative. The only thing left is, I will go and say harass a Muslim shop owner and think that, this is me avenging the wrongs of the past. Right. And I think that is where this link needs to be broken. Right. Firstly, the fact that, this has no real, this should have no real world bearing, but it sadly does. Because the narrative is built like that, right? That, this is what Hindus should do now. And also this, forewarning for the future, that if we don't do anything now, in the next 15 years, the minority population will surpass you. There's a huge WhatsApp fear that is instilled, Hindu khatre mein, that you're sort of in danger, because look at the Muslims, all they do every day is just make babies. So there is also now this idea that a lot of RSS ideologues would go ahead and say that Hindu women should take this responsibility of producing 3 children, right? Which is ridiculous in a population like ours, which is just spilling like crazy. To say something like this just makes no sense. And statistically, it is, I hate the fact that I even have to clarify, but statistically, it's just not possible that 12% of Muslims in the coming 15-20 years will somehow overtake 88% of Indian population. But this is how it is. This is how it has been created. And therefore, you have a lot of these vigilante groups that come up, and they will do so-called real-world action. Another thing that they join together is when it comes to the idea of cow protection. So a lot of these cow protection vigilante groups are there. They will randomly, stop a truck which they think is carrying meat, think that this is beef, and lynch a Muslim for it. This happens in trains. You'll see a very old Muslim person who's probably carrying some mutton. You're eating beef and he'll get beaten up. So there is a very sad real world consequence of it, where there is actual violence which is happening on the ground. And it all stems from this narrative that, we've been in 1,000 years of slavery, and we now need to sort of, sad to sort of put it that way, we now need to weed these people out, who did this brutality or cruelty towards us. And it's even sadder because now that it's in the textbooks, it is happening at a very germane level. These are 11-year-old, 12-year-olds. Not only are they now being served this poison through their textbooks, they're now being told that the next Bollywood movie which comes up, which talks about how Hindus were wronged, you're supposed to look at that as an educational material. And I am a millennial, so I was born in the 90s. Whenever I would go, to watch a Bollywood movie, something like, say, Jodha Akbar, etc., I always went with this idea that, this is just a movie, and that I could, if I wanted, fact check it and see if they're actually, talking something which is historically established or not established. We would have a very different sort of a discussion in school, and not take it at face value. So I think this is just really shocking at one level, that this is happening, in the sense that this has massive real world consequences. Same with contested sites, right? There is now this idea every time, for example, I talk about a mosque and I put a video, there'll be 5 people saying that if you dig underneath it, there'll be a, mandir, right? That there'll be a temple. Very common thing. Right. So even when I try, so for example, with Sambhal or with Gyanvapi, when I try and problematize the whole thing, but because temple destruction in itself is a very fascinating subject of history, and there is just so much layers to it. But a lot of it is just also fabrication, right? Which was done by the English at some point of time, because, they had their own problems of the discipline not being developed and them not knowing a good amount of archaeology, them mixing interpretation with analysis, this, that, and the other. So a lot of that, also weighs into it. But I think because the narrative is so well entrenched in the people's mind, the moment they say that, this is a mosque, but there is, got to be, for example, Taj Mahal right now, right? In 2017, it was very categorically stated by the Archaeological Survey of India that this monument has always been a mausoleum and nothing else. But now you see the Allahabad High Court has issued a notice to both the ASI and the center government saying, what is your view about Taj Mahal? We have a petition which says that it was probably a Shiva temple. So it's fascinating that from 2017 to 2026, 9 years, nothing could have changed. In my memory, I don't think Taj Mahal has ever been converted in these 9 years. But it's fascinating that the narrative has built itself so well that now the Allahabad High Court has to. In 2005, the same Allahabad High Court had dismissed a petition, very similar petition which said that, this was a Shiva temple. So fascinatingly, now 21 years later, the Allahabad High Court wants to consider this as something worth of value. Right. So just to see, in real time, how quickly the narrative is spread and how well it is now entrenched in the minds of not just people, but even institutions like courts, etc., that they think it's plausible to sort of ask the ASI and the center if there's anything here.
And the seriousness with which it is being taken is also quite fascinating, that people are actually and that adds to the narrative that if there wasn't anything, why would the court even entertain this? So that it's all adding to that narrative. Deepa, we'll move a little bit away from that. Western tech platforms rely on a deeply colonial dynamic extracting engagement and profit from South Asian hate speech while outsourcing content moderation to underpaid global South labor that is deliberately under-resourced. Can you talk a little bit about Silicon Valley's algorithmic incentives that turn diaspora-generated digital hate into actual material violence against marginalized people in India? I think you're on
Yes,
mute.
absolutely. No, yeah. Sorry, I had to think about that. That was that's a deep question. I I think actually we can connect it back to what Dr. Sharma was just talking about. And I think it's really important, like, to think about the spread of these narratives and how those systems are actually already created to do that, right? Because they're actually created to engage. Like, so the question is, how do they spread so fast? How do they get so entrenched? It's because algorithms are based on your engagement, right? I always actually tell students that likes and shares and views are capital. So imagine having $1,000. Are you willing to spend 10 of those dollars on cat videos every day that you want to like? I joke about this, right? And everyone laughs and they're like, yes, I am. I'm committed to cat videos, right? And so, but the idea here is for us to think about our digital lives and like moving through the digital world. And every time we give engagement to something, right, we're telling the algorithm that we like it and that it should have more attention, right? This is how these algorithms are set up. This is how these systems are set up. So when Dr. Sharma is telling us about a narrative that just was dismissed, right, 9 years earlier, and now is so entrenched and so like people are just coming at you with these like fabricated histories and facts, right? It's in part because they have been having conversations, right, that have been curated for them in spaces. So places like WhatsApp, where you're already talking to groups that you know, right? Thinking about when we're talking about Silicon Valley, we're talking about all the different platforms that they have created for us. So
Yeah.
you're thinking about like, someone like Zuckerberg and his whole metaverse, right? So you have a number of platforms. I always tell people, I know that it feels like whatever platform you're using at 18 is the platform for life. Like I have students that are like, how do people communicate when there wasn't TikTok? I'm like, it's banned in like a lot of countries. So, but ultimately, Facebook is still the world's largest platform, bar none. In the United States, a lot of people don't realize that it's YouTube,
Oh,
and
yes.
Facebook is a close second. In India, Instagram is in the top three. So, and Instagram is interesting because Indians that use Instagram, 60% of them own a car and an iPhone, or an iPhone, I should say. So that means that they are pretty wealthy. Most of the world uses Android. So these are things that I look at when I think about what Silicon Valley has done. So it's not just the colonialization of the platform, it's the capitalization of the platform, right? So they've created a situation in which our engagements with people, let's use that term lightly, have been monetized. And we are the consumers of that, right? So you determine whether an idea is a niche idea or a good idea, but it's not determined based on merit or research or peer review. And I'm not saying, I'm not an elitist academic. I'm not suggesting, Dr. Sharma is a public historian, right? But what she points out, I think really importantly, that I couldn't say any better, is that it is important for us to be accurate and have accurate information. Going to a Bollywood film is not accurate information, right? And AI makes that so that everybody feels like they're an armchair historian. It's going to only make it worse, right? And these are platforms that have been built by places like Silicon Valley in order for them to be able to influence what people buy, right? And they also want to pay less taxes. So they're really trying to influence people. But people like Peter Thiel are ideological. So he's not just a guy who wants people to buy things so he makes more money, but he's also a Christian nationalist and a white nationalist. So he's invested in things like he will promote narratives along with Elon Musk, who owns Twitter, that promote white nationalism theory, right? Alongside that, if you look on Twitter before we were basically cut out of all of the data sets, you will see that white nationalist theories also push Muslim replacement theory in India. So these types of replacement theory narratives, right? They find hate finds hate and it engages. Again, they don't have to eat together. They're hating together. So this is why people who, for example, like Robert Spencer, not Richard Spencer, but Robert Spencer, who runs a website called Jihad Watch, which is complete nonsense history on Islam. It's just Islamophobia. Gets retweeted by groups like the Hindu American Foundation. They had shared his work because it aligns with their narrative. Why would they have even engaged with it? I don't actually believe that they went out and found it. I believe that when they posted things, that in their algorithm that this was shown, and it seemed like it aligned with what they. So I'm just saying that oftentimes what they created that was really about bringing customers together with businesses, and Instagram is the #1 marketing platform in the world of all social media. It is a place to buy stuff now, and companies love it. It really does. 64% of Instagram users have purchased something on Instagram. So anyway, my point is that if you think about that, what that has made is a network, I should say, of platforms that are incredibly conducive, right, to the kind of misinformation and leveraging of those networks. The other problem here, and we're seeing it currently in India, and we are also seeing it in the United States, right, with the current administration, is that when you have like 4 guys who control all of our ways of digitally communicating. This is why Signal, shout out to Meredith Whittaker, who's awesome. And this is why everyone should have Signal, because Meredith Whittaker, if you don't know who she is, look her up. She is an amazing tech CEO who created who manages an ethical product in Signal, but it's very hard to be that person, right? So everybody else is connected. When India decided to pass their draconian social media law, I think it was in 2019, after they shut down the internet in Kashmir for a year without, no reason for that, really. That law they did with the permission of Twitter and Facebook because they were threatened that they wouldn't get to vote. They operate there. It's a lot of money. So if we are basically facing our free speech rights and the rights of democracy and democratic information sharing and gathering, right, on whether or not tech CEOs are going to agree with a new government, like that's not information. And that to me is the scarier part of all of this. It's not even about whether, like, maybe they would be a benevolent tech CEO, maybe they wouldn't be Peter Thiel, but that's not necessarily how we should want to, like, these platforms are too integral, right? And I think a government saying we should regulate them isn't necessarily crazy, but when you have a government that's a bad actor that's going to like go in and do these kinds of deals, right? Now you saw that, you're seeing that like they've shut down the internet. India's favorite thing to do is shut down the internet more than any nation in the world, democratic or not. I don't really understand how they get away with doing this so often, but it's shocking. It's like it was 115 times in 2020, and the closest nation to them was Myanmar, and it was 15. When I say they shut down the internet all the time, it was 87 times last year. No nation comes close. Iran is like 7. So let's just be clear that this is a thing India does, and they shut down the internet again around Jantar Mantar and around various other places, not just there. They also did it in Kolkata. They also did it in Mumbai, right? So they're also targeting. That ability to do that is directly connected to the platform governance issues that we have in terms of who owns these platforms, how they're putting out information, how those structures of information are out there. So it's not just a question, I'll end with this, of whether or not platforms, like there's a great piece out that's looking at like AI and caste bias that was produced by an author for the Center for Organized Hate. And so people can look that up. And I think that's super important work. It's the kind of work that I'm interested in. But I also think it's really important that we understand that these platforms are set up for profit, and profit is built on engagement. Hate breeds engagement. So until we do that, there is no content moderation. There is no incentive for governments to step in, like, right? So we can have this conversation. I think it's really important, but I also think it's really important why this is always a political conversation, because without Peter Thiel is actually influencing the government, and he's not just influencing his own government, he's influencing whatever government you have. Like, it doesn't matter where you live, right? If we don't have the dual conversation, it's going to be really hard to say, well, it sucks to be harassed online, or wow, I'm getting all this misinformation, because ultimately we need to have a better system of like how we understand these platforms and what they can do. Google once said that they can't change the algorithm, and then they adjusted the algorithm. And this was in response to Nazi propaganda being shared in Germany, which is against the law. And they said, well, we can't help it. It's the algorithm. And Germany said, well, we're going to ban you. And then they said, we adjusted the algorithm. So it's scary to think of on both sides, is what I would say.
Gosh, so much in there. And I'm so glad that we're having this conversation, because all of this nuance doesn't really come out in social media, in everyday conversation, and it's so directly related to our everyday lives. But we don't talk about these things now. That's been great, and it's been really great to ask both of you questions. But one of the goals of the Desh Videsh series is to create genuine dialogue across experiences, perspectives, rather than just, questions and answers. So I'd like to invite each of you to pose a question to each other about whatever you've heard, or perhaps something that we've not covered so far. Ruchika, would you like to start?
Sure. But before I start, I just wanted to share the good news. I think the education minister has finally resigned. I just learned of this, and I think it's it's so nice to see finally a protest in my life that has actually led to the results that it actually wanted to. I've seen CANRC, and I've seen the farmers protest. I've seen so much of this being just rubbished, and so much of violence being brought upon these people with very little, gains. I think farmers movement was also quite successful in that sense. But I think this is really cool that this has happened. Deepa, I just wanted to ask if there are somebody like me, who does this and invests a lot of time doing this to sort of counter a lot of historical misinformation online. Are there interesting ways in which one can do so? I think especially when it comes to WhatsApp, because you said you're somebody who's interested in meaning making. So I wanted to know if you know the way a WhatsApp message is crafted in itself is very interesting, right? How there is a premise, the central premise being that we've been wronged, and we've been wronged by the Muslims, and then there is, of course, evidence to sort of support that, right? And then there is a call to action, right? So I was wondering if you sort of had, time to sort of take apart, messages like that, or narratives like that, and how they're sort of crafted in writing to become very palatable, but also very believable to the person who's reading it. How they, for example, if at all, appeal to authority, and what sort of an authority that is, and sort of building on that. How can that sort of then empower historians like me, who are public facing historians, and want to sort of combat a lot of this online, and have been combating but want to do even better?
I mean, I think you're doing great work with that, and that's exactly what we need. We do have public historians in the U.S., but not usually on India. Usually, we have enough misinformation, unfortunately. All of those things that you just said, we also have. Just switch out caste for slavery, switch out, Muslim replacement for white replacement, right? It's all the same arguments, right? So you have people like Heather Cox Richardson who are out there writing their daily letters to Americans, trying to help people. And I think that people who read blogs do really well. Independent journalists do really well with this. I write publicly as you can Google me and unfortunately find AI generated hate, but also find stuff I've written. And my contribution to this is to train my students, my PhD students, to write publicly, because I think it's really important for PhD students to be able to communicate their research to not only, my advisor used to say my mother's bridge club, and I was like, no one has played bridge the last century in this country, but okay. But anyone, right? A person on the street, you should be able to communicate your PhD research in a way that is not completely mind numbing, right? In a minute, and say something interesting about it. So that's why I spend a lot of time being like, yeah, I study, hate online. And people are like, I want to know more, even though it is gimmicky, right? Like I teach a class on gender and identity, and I call it Woman as the Gateway to Hell. Not because it's a gimmick, it's a literal translation from a Sanskrit text, right? So I can say that. So I think I mean, for me, we should be learning. Like, I love that you asked that. We should be learning with social media posts that go viral from the right wing, from propaganda, and then using that as a way to structure. And that is essentially right. Like, you have to have a hook. You have to have something that draws your attention, something you care about. So perhaps it's like a violence you care about. Like, I'll tell you that the stuff I used to get from family members was always like opened with like, Hindu girl raped like Muslim something, you know what I mean? Like, so they were always concerned about that. And so things like that, I think we have to think about that in ways that aren't propagandistic, but real, right? And so here, the most effective posts are ones, for example, because we're dealing with federal Gestapo that's kidnapping our people for some reason. People voted for that. So, you know, people will post things like ICE kidnapping, right? And then people will stop. So I
Let
think
it be
for
seen.
us, thinking about it that way, right, is what I would say. Should I just jump into a brief question or no?
Yes, but we also kind of like now coming to the tail end of this, and I have
Oh,
one more
sorry.
question,
Yeah.
Q&As, but please, you have a question as well for
That's
Ruchika.
okay. I can reserve it for the end and you can go ahead. That's okay.
Let's we'll get through your question and then we'll move on. It's
Okay.
all.
Well, no, Dr. Sharma, I just wanted to know actually more about how you got about bringing this, you know, bringing your public platform together and sort of what made you decide actually to choose these two languages. Have you ever thought about bringing on folks like, I loved when you talked about how you were reaching out in Hindi because I think a lot about this, like about even the things that I write about. How do you get them out to a broader audience? And I was wondering if like you'd ever thought about like, you know, sharing your own work and finding other folks that do other languages in India. Because I would love just personally to, if you wouldn't mind shooting me a link, I'd love to check you out. So
Absolutely. I'd certainly shoot you a link. But I think I started, so when I was doing my MPhil, one of the things that I would do is to contribute to a lot of these um, uh, online dailies like Scroll and The Wire. They still continue to do fantastic work. And I would basically, because there was a lot of misinformation that was, spoken at that point of time as well. But this is very early on. This is 2014, 2015, when it had just started at a very unprecedented level, with the government's backing, etc. So I was still writing about it. And I would take a lot of these different so-called pegs, which would sort of make people debate about history at that point. And for example, this idea of 1,000 years of slavery, and then sort of dissecting that idea, or the phenomena of architectural reuse, which is a very common thing that has happened across history, not just Indian history, but we have pagan shrines being reused, made into churches, etc. So I was writing about that for the longest time. But then I think once I got into my PhD and started teaching, I realized when I would, interact with my students, undergrad students, I realized that um, a lot of the things that I used to think were basic knowledge about history is something that a lot of people don't know about. For example, this very innocent question, I think a first year undergrad had asked me, and she was very enthusiastic about it. We were having a discussion on caste, and she said that I know that caste is a huge problem, but it is a problem which has occurred now. If you look at it in ancient India, there was no idea of a caste. And it was so, it was, and she said it in such a well-meaning way that we were once very nice people, but because of other people, we've become corrupt. The religion itself is not corrupt. She was sort of defending it. So that's when I realized that I think even something as basic as, say, the Purusha Sukta hymn in the Rig Veda is something that a lot of people are just unaware about, right? So which is when this idea came about, of making videos. Initially, like I said, it was in English because that was a language that I was very comfortable with. But eventually, I switched to Hindi, and I think now it reaches my monthly reach of these videos is around 4 million, 4 to 5 million, and a lot of these are in the 18 to 45 age group, which I think is my core group, the group that I really want to appeal to. And I mean, I don't have exact statistics in the number of, in terms of impact, I think, because the platforms that I engage with are very basic about, they will not tell me the person who's listening to you has voted for the BJP, and then 2 years later he stopped voting for the BJP. I don't think they tell me this, but they do tell me things like, how many women are now watching versus how many women were watching. So I've seen an increase in female audience. I have seen, this acquiring. So initially there would be a lot of dislikes on my, videos. Now I see, there is like a massive surge of likes and very few dislikes, etc. So it's fascinating to see people are now engaging with whatever I make for a longer time. So if it's a 20-minute video, I see people engaging for 10 minutes or 12 minutes versus when I used to make it earlier, it was like 3 minutes or 4 minutes. I think I have also sort of gotten better with it, I think. So I think the only reason why I do this is because, as I was explaining earlier, there is a real world consequences to these myths. And that is what I want to be sort of instrumental in stopping. I want to sort of break that link where this person thinks that because these Muslims were so terrible to us, I want to be able to sort of go and, wreck a poor Muslim person's shop, or lynch a Muslim on the streets. I want to be able to sort of break that link, and this is the reason why I started sort of doing it. And I'm always obviously looking for ways. So since you said other languages, so a lot of my writings that I do now for The Wire, etc., for example, this contested site called the Bhojashala was very recently declared as a temple. It's a mosque, and it's been a mosque for the past 700 years. And it's ridiculous that with the Places of Worship Act in place, that 700 years of history of it being a mosque has been completely erased. So I had written, as to how this was again an English mess up. The British had sort of messed this history up. So I'd written a 1500 uh, piece, and somebody had gotten in touch with me and said, there are two translations, Urdu translations of your piece that have gone up, in one Urdu daily in Hyderabad and the other one in Kashmir. And I thought that's really cool that, these are sort of, going in different languages as well. It's actually one of my dreams to, ensure that whatever I write, and this is something that YouTube is now also doing, which is my main platform. It allows this auto dubbing feature. So you can now sort of dub it in different languages. So I think Bangla is one of the languages that you can now dub in, and so, as well as Punjabi. And I sort of allow that on my videos so that, if somebody wants to sort of hear it, it's a terrible voice, it's an AI voice, but at least, it gets it gets the gist of what I'm saying across. So you're absolutely right. I think more languages is something that I am also looking forward to sort of being able to reach out to.
Great. That was such a great answer. Thank you. Now we've got one question that I have, which is my final question, and then we've got a couple in the comments. So I'm going to go through now a little bit quicker. I did want to emphasize why it's critical for Hindus for Human Rights to hold this specific space. For too long, of course, right-wing movements have claimed a monopoly on history using manufactured myths as weapons to dictate who belongs and who gets erased. And we've kind of spoken about many examples now. When we push back, we are falsely accused of being anti-Hindu. We reject that entirely, of course. Demanding historical accuracy isn't an attack on our culture. It is a fundamental responsibility to truth, civil rights, public memory. So we look ahead. Our work goes far beyond just reacting to viral lies as they appear. So, how do we build a proactive movement for historical truth that actually protects real scholarship, such as yours, defends pluralism against majoritarian authoritarianism, and offers a grounded, hopeful vision for the future? And I think today is a great day to talk about hope. Would any of you like to take that quickly, maybe a minute each?
Deepa, do you want to go first?
Yeah, no, I think that there is hope, right? Like, but I also think that I'll quickly say one thing about this is that to me, like, I'm not a person who tends to lose hope, although I feel like we've kind of been really tested in those limits, not just in India, but in the US right now. And I think US has a lot to learn from Modi. I've been shouting, old man shouts at clouds about this, and I'm like, Modi's capture, and how he did what he did is something that US needs to pay attention to if they don't want to lose their country. But I think that the reason we should have hope is that it is inevitable that fascist strongmen will make mistakes, and also precisely what they have done here. Dr. Sharma has pointed out that these kinds of myths have consequences, and I also noted early on that you're now dealing with a populace that doesn't have any boogeyman vision of Congress, right? This is your mess. You own it. So the other thing I would say is that I think that as we keep that hope in mind, we should temper it. There's been some questions in the chat, so I'll quickly say this too about that. Like, I think that removing the BJP and Hindutva is a different project than bringing about an equitable India. And I wouldn't have necessarily said that before, but that's one of the reasons to me that CAA and RC protests kind of went the way they are. It's also the reason that Muslims and Dalits and people that are oppressed right now are hanging back. And I think it's smart of them to do so. This is middle class India's fight. This is their project of bringing this person here. The middle class India needs to get rid of him. And then the project of equity can begin.
Thank you for that. Ruchika, would you like to take that as well?
I think I kind of agree with what Deepa said. And I think at the heart of it, the whole idea of this creation of this identity of that you are Hindu phobic simply because you say something which they consider to be Hindu history. I think that in itself needs to be broken. The fact that there is a Muslim history and that there is a Hindu history. You cannot sort of divide history, especially a history of a subcontinent as diverse as India, into these two religious silos. Because like I said, the way we look at religion today wasn't the case at that point of time. And there is no one identity of the Hindu. Even, if you look at Muslim identity, there's so much of internecine warfare, Shias versus the Sunnis, and the Sunni kings are going and breaking Shia mosques, etc. So this whole idea of Hindu history in itself needs to be dismantled. And also the idea, somewhere down the line, which I think a lot of people are sort of sadly under the ambit of, which is the fact that Hinduism is Hindutva, which is not the case. There has to be a difference between the two. Hinduism is a religion. Of course, as a term, it's a 20th century construct. And there is a lot that went into it when the British first came to define it. It was very negatively defined as not Christian and not Muslim. That in itself, that is where the problem lies, right? And versus, this idea of Hindutva, which is a political movement, which starts off in the 1920s with Savarkar, etc. And then, has a life of its own. And how, there is a huge amount of things which were very central to the idea of Hinduism. For example, this idea of assimilation. So very recently I had made a video about how Sai Baba, which is a deity who was a Muslim fakir, but he was also worshipped by a lot of the Indian nationalists who were non-Muslims, who were Hindus. And he was for the longest time worshipped by both Hindus and Muslims. And this is a very common practice in Hinduism, wherein you would have a fakir or a Baba-like figure who's worshipped, by everybody, irrespective of your leanings. Even the Sufi saints were worshipped like that for the longest time. In fact, something that I like to use an example a lot is Yogi Adityanath, and the Nath Panthis. They have a very different history as to what he is now. In fact, I think just 300, 400 years later, one of the Nath Panthis was a person called Pir Baba Haji Ratan Nath. Now, he is a Sufi saint as well as a Nath Panthi. He's both, and he's worshipped as both for the longest time. There is, of course, a very interesting trajectory of as to how the Nath Panthis also become Hindutvified in the 20th century, but I don't want to get into that. But it's fascinating to see as to how Hindutva actually takes away. So very recently, like I was telling you, this video talked about how just in the 10 years, so much of Sai Baba's cult is being eroded. because, he's considered to be Muslim. So you have people like Yati Narsinganand, etc., who say that, he was a Pakhandi, and therefore he was a jihadi, and therefore, there were people who in Delhi went and broke his idol. His idols are being removed. They're sort of being wrapped in a white cloth in temples where, his idol was installed. So it's fascinating to see as to how a lot of the Hinduism, which was all about assimilating, and so many gods which are considered important today have come from a process of assimilation. Assimilation is something that Hindutva hates. It's a very exclusionary movement in that sense. It wants to, in fact, reduce Hinduism to something that it considers is the correct form of Hinduism. And also this idea that you're not Hindu enough, etc., is a very Hindutva political thing. So I think when somebody says that you're Hinduphobic or anti-Hindu, in a sense, firstly, it doesn't mean anything, because there is no idea of, fearing Hinduism, or just the fact that, there is somebody who has Hindu identity. It's a created idea. But also at the heart of it, what the person is alleging is that you are either attacking their idea of history, which is a religious history, or, you are anti-Hindutva, which I think both are valid opinions to have. One must be anti-Hindutva for all the right reasons, and one must be anti the idea of a religious history, because that doesn't make any sense, that you will paint 4,000 years of history with just one religion. It makes no sense.
Thank you for that. Now we've got 3 questions here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to combine the first and the third, and maybe we can go quite quickly. So Shanti Raman says, is it time for the left to actually come together constructively, support the youth, and be united in defeating right-wing nationalism and Hindutva? And then Anjali Sharma says, what can we do to dismantle the Hindutva spin on Hindu history? I think we've touched on these a little bit, but any final thoughts on this? Maybe just a minute, and one of you.
I just quickly want to respond what Shanti Raman has said. I think it's actually time for historians to come together. I really don't care whether they are left-leaning or right-leaning. Anybody who's done some serious study of history has expertise of history. I actually have nothing against a right-wing idea of Indian history. I think because it has become very synonymous with the disinformation which is being peddled in the name of history, we tend to look at the idea of a right-wing history as something which is not worth it. But there should be a right-wing idea of history, because I think the good thing about history, and the more enriched it becomes, is when it has multiple perspectives. But that has to come from somebody who has an expertise in history, who is making his arguments, with following historical methodology, right? And also the way we look at left and right in the popular parlance is very distorted. I was in a debate at the Calcutta Debating Circle in January, and one of the questions that was posed on to me was, why have left liberal historians, destroyed the historical narrative of India, or something like that, which I thought was ridiculous to, sort of combine left as well as liberal. These are like two different ideologies altogether. So I think popularly also this idea of left is very misunderstood. Do you mean left ideologically, or do you mean somebody who is a historian and practices historical materialism? Because that is a different sort of Marxist, view of Indian history. So that in itself becomes something that the nuances needs to be fine-tuned. But coming back to the question, I think it's very important, if you are a serious historian and you think of history as your craft, it's very important in India to sort of come forward and do your bit, whatever you can, to combat this disinformation, because it is not just going to stop at, say, NCERT or whatever. It's now taken over, for example, universities. Right. So I understand that there are a lot of these historians who are sort of scared of losing their jobs, etc. But there is a good chance that in 10 years, actual historians will not be hired anymore in universities, because there is this whole idea that if you've actually studied history, you must have only studied left idea of history, and we no longer want that. Right. So it's fascinating that this is happening, and therefore it's very important for all historians who take Indian history seriously, who have expertise to come together and sort of combat this onslaught of myth, Hindutva myths masquerading as history.
Thank you. Neda Khan has an interesting question. As a Muslim, I think if Muslims were in the majority in India, Hindus would have experienced similar sentiments. So, do you believe it has more to do with education, culture, and the caste system? There are a lot of Muslims who also follow the caste system in India, which she believes is a deeper problem. And that's such an interesting question. Unfortunately, we don't have too much time for that, but if you'd like to wrap that up.
Yeah, I'll just say something. I think that's a really important point. I mean, caste is much more than a religious system. Caste is a community system. It's a system that's built on things like trade. But those trades also big had value judgments, right? So those value judgments, that's one of the reasons that what Dr. Sharma was saying earlier about Purusha Sukta is so important, because a lot of people have divorced this from its actual implications for real world and suggested it was some like happy pie in the sky like myth that just made everybody just happily live together, and then we just screwed it up with Muslims. Again, Muslims and British somehow created it. And I think Neda's point is really well taken. So this is, I think I'll just underscore what I said before, which is that this is why I think it's two different projects in India. And I think that one of the frustrations that the left is having right now in India is that they feel like they've been yelling about Hindutva. I will say I am part of that yelling. I have been yelling about this since these people doxed me. I had to I had to get police protection. I've had to deal with the FBI. They are the worst people I have ever met in my life. And I'm just like a normal Sanskrit scholar. And I ended up doing the stuff I'm doing because I couldn't be that anymore. That's what Hindutva took from me, is my entire life as a Sanskrit scholar to now become a media scholar. And I don't even use the languages. I'm fluent in Sanskrit and Tamil. I don't even do that work, right? So I want to say that like a lot of people in the left have been yelling about this since 2014. A lot of us have been yelling about the funding networks in the US and in Canada, that we have been talking about this. We have been dismissed by regular Indians, Hindus, middle class folks as not understanding the development needs of India. This is like a thing I've gotten, right? Like all of these things, right? And the history stuff. And they're like, oh, what does it matter if people make a few mistakes? That was an actual quote from an uncle I had who has a PhD. And I was just like, okay. And then at what point do you just give up, right? And now you're seeing people come out and say these things as if they weren't said. So I think we're going to have two projects. That's what I would leave. And Neda is right. The project that is deeper and harder and will be like very difficult will be removing the cultural terror of caste, the cultural terror of Islamophobia, right? The cultural terror of misogyny and patriarchy and rape culture. One woman is raped every 16 minutes in India. That has to change, right? All of that is a separate project than the emergency. The emergency right now is Hindutva is in charge of the government, and that is an emergency. Imagine the ship is sinking, but the ship has holes. We can't fix the holes right now. We have to fix the ship from sinking and then the holes. And those are going to be hard to plug.
I knew there would be a hopeful message at the end. Thank you for
Can
that.
I just add to what Deepa said very quickly? I think this is what she said was absolutely correct. I think caste is the bigger problem, because even in Indian history, you would see these projects by the kings of fostering a sort of a religious harmony. But I don't see any king or any sort of a pre-modern state taking up caste and thinking of actually dismantling it, or putting out ordinances, etc., which say that caste discrimination is a terrible thing. There have been many, for example, Nanak, etc., who've sort of spoken about discrimination, but not the system itself, right? So the discrimination, because it's such an extreme thing, it's sort of easier to recognize, but to realize that discrimination is sort of the symptom and the system in itself is the problem, right? So I think, therefore, I think the caste is the bigger problem, because it has been entrenched for so long. And like she rightly pointed out, even Muslims have adopted to that. It's sort of this hydra, which sort of took, even a religion which in theory says that everybody is equal. You only differ in terms of your piety, which is Islam. But actually, on ground, you'd see very different. There is this idea of Ajlaf and the Ashraf, etc., that, we are Sayyid Muslims and, you are not Sayyid Muslims and all of that. So I think caste is a huge problem. And as Deepa rightly said, misogyny as well, because I don't think this is something where I think, irrespective of the religion, everybody sort of comes together for these two systems to sort of prevail.
Sorry to interrupt, but last comment by Pradeep Sarkar, who says, what about the Buddhist kings, Ashoka and Kanishka? Did they not try to dismantle caste? And after this is so interesting that I don't want to stop, but I think I will have to stop right after this. So if you'd like to comment on that very quickly.
Yeah, no, I think Ashok didn't. There is a myth about the fact that Ashok. So if you look at even his Kalinga inscription, one of the first things that he mentions is that he's sad that, he's killed so many people. But most of all, he's sad that he's killed so many Brahmins. So there is this idea of Brahmanical supremacy that even he accepts. The Buddha did, right? So, but what the Buddha did was not challenge caste itself. Buddha actually challenged the supremacy of the Vedas and Brahmanical supremacy, right? The system in itself, the way it's steered, was just not there, right? So, for example, if you read the three Pitakas, the Buddha identifies himself as a Kshatriya. Right? There is a very clear idea that he's a Kshatriya. He identifies people as Brahmins, etc. Right? So, of course, there is a challenge to the Brahmanical supremacy. But if you look at, for example, the Sangha, and this is something that Romila Thapar, etc., have written about, even the Sangha was organized on the basis of caste. Right? So, while there were attempts to minimize the discrimination, like I was saying, that this caste system causes, there is no attempt to dismantle the system itself. Even Ashok pays lip service to Brahmanical supremacy. Even the Buddha doesn't, question the system itself. For example, why should a person who's born to a sweeper become a sweeper? It's just never a question that, either Ashok or Buddha ever raised. It's a very, very basic, germane question that, So I don't think that they actually try to dismantle the system itself. It was more geared towards the discrimination, which I think a lot of people have tried to do.
Thank you so much. And we've had a really enriching, far-ranging sort of conversation. And I think it's a great start. And I hope more people engage with this. We thank everyone who has attended. If you're interested in joining our movement to dismantle caste and Hindutva, please consider joining Hindus for Human Rights. There are chapters in the UK. I think there was a question about, are there any anti-Hindutva groups in the UK? So there's Hindus for Human Rights there, in Australia, in the US, and of course, everything's on socials. So there are a lot of conversations like this and dialogue, and I think that's so sorely missing from our public spaces, genuine dialogue. Deepa has something to say.
Oh, Nandini, I just wanted to correct one piece of seemingly information that was incorrect in the Q&A. Somebody had asked whether or not Peter Thiel could be both gay and a Christian nationalist. He is actually both gay and a Christian nationalist, and that is an incredibly common thread. If anyone wants to know more, you can email me. But white gay men as Christian nationalists, super common. They absolutely have no shame. So just want to make sure that I put that out there. Thank you.
There's the hook, Deepa, that you were talking about, the hook to a more interesting conversation. But with that, thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening, and I hope we connect soon again.
Thank you so much.